I came into this game expecting an RPG in the vein of Deus Ex or Fallout, but what I got was an open world first person shooter meets Mass Effect, where your choices don't mean much until the very end. I expected dialogue choices that would change the world around you, or that would change the story path to something wildly different to someone else's playthrough. But that isn't the case here, because everyone who plays this will have the same experience no matter what choices you make in the game. And the choices are few and far between. No matter what life path you begin the game with, you will inevitably follow the main story that everyone will follow, with the only difference being some dialogue choices that don't really change the direction of the story or the narrative. Dialogue is set up like a tiered system, where your choices are a yellow colored sentence that advances the story or scene, and a blue colored sentence that lengthens the dialogue, providing more character interaction but isn't necessary to the scene. So if you want to learn more about these characters or the world, choose the blue sentences. Unfortunately, most of the time, blue sentence choices added so much dialogue to the scene, it ends up feeling like a waste of time. They don't add much character development that couldn't have just been used in a cutscene. And that's where most of the dialogue should have been anyway. You'll choose each blue dialogue choice just to hear them drone on and on about something you might not care about. And sometimes they'll deliver a line in a weird way that doesn't fit the mood of the scene. Hell yeah when everyone is being serious just feels off-putting. Although I have to admire how much dialogue actually is in the game. But I feel that they knew some people would be put off by it, and so they added a skip dialogue function. About the only time dialogue choices do make a difference is when you're met with any sort of conflict. Do you want to defuse a situation or make it worse? It's the choice between firefight or a peaceful resolve. If you're leveled up far enough, then there are more choices available to you, but it basically ends up being the same thing. Though sometimes you can avoid scenarios altogether if you have enough tech ability, and you'll still be able to advance the story. It's clever that they thought of this, but it tells me that there was much more to this game than the developers were able to deliver. And that's how I felt about Cyberpunk. Like there was something missing, like maybe I missed a scene or a part of the story that may not have been clearly explained as well as I'd have liked. Sometimes I will go into missions not knowing what I have to do or even why I'm there. And this could be a result of the game having so much dialogue that it isn't digestible, or delivered in a way that isn't fun to listen to. Sometimes the people giving you the mission deliver their lines in a very monotone and somber way. I get that they're trying to set a mood, but when the mission boils down to go here and go get an object, do I really need a 20-minute scene where you're describing the details of the entire heist? Sometimes the game needs to get to the point. Other times, the wordy dialogue is done well, but I feel you'll appreciate it more if you're after doing all of the side missions and really want to get immersed in the world. But honestly, a lot of the dialogue choices don't leave an impact and could have been better served in a cutscene. I referenced Mass Effect earlier because most of the dialogue in that game is very similar to this. There are a lot of different choices that build the world, but that don't necessarily affect the story. But in Mass Effect, you are invested in the world and in the characters, and they don't throw so much at you all at once. They build up to it, and even then it doesn't feel like small talk. It feels like what they're talking about is part of the scene. Cyberpunk tries to do this as well, but not nearly as much as it needed to get me to care about the world it's trying to build. And since most of the time your choices don't really matter, you'll end up playing most of the game as a shooter and rarely, if ever, come at a situation from different ways. You'll always get caught if you try and play it stealthily, and hacking the enemies will always alert them to your presence. Any way you play it, it all ends up in a firefight. Every single encounter. Which is fine, since the gunplay and controls are adequate as any other first-person shooter, though the gun sections on top of cars are difficult to properly aim on. I stopped trying to play this as an RPG and just played it like a typical shooter set in an open world. It was then, and only then, that I started to have some fun with the game. The story still felt disjointed, like it was missing parts, but I stopped caring about trying to play the game in a way that it wasn't. So it isn't the Deus Ex that I was expecting. but a competent shooter in a cyberpunk world. Fair enough. But being an open world game leads it to have many of the same tropes that every open world has. Long expanses of driving sections and missions upon missions upon missions that may or may not loosely have an effect on the overall story. And if you want to complete 100% of the game, you'll be in Night City for a while. But then the feeling of missing features comes back, because you'll feel like there should have been a fast travel system or a train or something that doesn't require you to get into a car or motorcycle to get across the map. You see trains or monorail tracks around the city, but you're never able to find a train station to get on them. So maybe that's something that they weren't able to add in time. Although the driving isn't bad in the game, but just like any open world game, it takes some getting used to. You'll be running down pedestrians by accident, unlike Grand Theft Auto where you do it on purpose. Eventually you'll be able to buy better, faster cars, but it seemed like a waste of money when you can always jack someone's car and no one will bother you. The police system really is not working in this game. Sometimes the cops will be on you immediately, and sometimes they won't care what you do. In any case, avoiding them is easy as avoiding their line of sight for a few meters. I just feel like this game wasn't ready for the open world genre, and probably should have been much more linear and section off parts of the city to focus on the story. Don't get me wrong, I love the feeling of the open world, but it just isn't developed enough as it should have been. Especially after we've been in fantastic open worlds like Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption. And this is ironic since the game already feels extremely linear. Even with the plethora of missions the game literally throws at you every 5 minutes. You can be in the middle of one mission while you're getting a text or a call telling you about another mission. Like, can I finish this mission first? I'm in the middle of a desert and you want me to stop and drive all the way back to the city and start another mission? Thankfully, it doesn't matter when you do these missions because they aren't timed, they just make you think that they are. So when you eventually finish the game, which I have not done yet, but I've read online about, you'll have some ending choices that affect what your character does. But from what I've read, it feels like Mass Effect 3, where there really is only one right choice. And for me, yes, destroy is the only choice that matters in Mass Effect. Indoctrination theory is real. I suggest you save the game before the last missions and see all the different endings. And there are some romance options in the game that kind of affects the ending as well, but it's not drastic. But the game itself, aside from the bugs and glitches that are constantly being worked on, is competent when it works. The graphics are beautiful, even if you aren't using ray tracing. Every nook and cranny of the city is covered in neon lights and atmospheric smoke that fills the air. It really is an interesting world that's been created, although there may be one too many nightclubs and sex clubs. This is more like Vegas 2077 than the LA of the future, but it works for the nitty-gritty vibe the game is going for. The global illumination shades the world very well, and character models and explosions look phenomenal. Although in some scenes, the characters and the geometry looks flat, like when you're driving in the car and the lighting model keeps changing. But in other scenes, you'd be able to fool yourself into thinking you had ray tracing enabled. If you have a beefy PC, you're in for a treat. I'm playing this on an Intel i5 processor and a GTX 980 Ti at very low 720p resolution and a 30 frames per second lock, but it still runs and looks fantastic with max graphical settings. Though you do have to set the mirror settings to low, otherwise the game will crash every time. Beefier PCs will be able to avoid this though. I know my PC may not sound impressive, but to be able to say that I can play this without having to buy a next-gen console or a graphics card is a win in my book. As for consoles, you may have a rougher time, but I see that my friends are playing on the base PS4 and they aren't complaining, so maybe your mileage may vary. Sound direction is nothing spectacular, but adequately sets the atmosphere and sense of space it's trying to convey. When you're in Night City, it sounds like you're in a crowded city, especially with surround sound. Combat is your standard fare, but I'm glad you're able to hipfire, as most games love to lock you down to gun sights. Weapons are mostly standard, but there are some fun weapons that you can use, like a sword, which is surprisingly the most fun weapon in the game. But where the combat is mostly shooting, you do have options to scan your enemies or the environment and use that to your advantage. You can hack your enemies' chips to short circuit them and lower their defenses for a time, giving you enough time to shoot them without them firing back. Or you can hack something around them to make it explode while you're behind cover, or hack something else to distract them away from you so you can sneak up on them and take them out quietly. Of course, this rarely works because as soon as you do this, you have to hide the body and hope you aren't seen, or you're in another firefight. The level design isn't meant for sneaking around in my opinion, but if you can get it to work, there are options in battles, so that's a nice touch. The more you level up, the more options you get, and you can craft certain objects from other objects and level up. It's all real nice and complicated, and that's why I never bothered with it. You can go into the menus and manually choose what to upgrade, but it became tedious and way too cluttered with menu screens on top of menu screens. Anytime I did level up was when I was forced to, when the enemies became a little tougher. And honestly, I didn't want to have to deal with menus when I was getting increasingly bored with the game. This is a game about its story, and aside from the adequate gunplay, the story left something to be desired. And for me, that something was choices. The choice to move the story forward in multiple ways that changed the outcome. But I was met with a shooting game that told me the story in short bursts, in between long stretches of skippable dialogue that I couldn't interact with in a meaningful way. I feel that there could have been a great story here because when things are happening, it does get fun, and some of the characters are really well written and acted. Jackie and Pan Am are great to be around and listen to, but they are few and far between. When the good parts show up, I get this glimmer of what the game could be. I felt that as soon as I started getting into the story and enjoying the game, when the mission ended, the fun stopped, and you're back to the long, drawn-out, boring bits where you have to meet someone and deal with all of this dialogue all over again. But again, I have no problem with lots of dialogue and voice acting. I just want it to mean something. I'm still playing a game, not an interactive movie where the only option is to press forward when I want to advance the story. Give me a reason to listen to all of this, or get to the point and tell it all in a cutscene. Unfortunately, what the developers were trying to create is not what became of the final product. And some may say that the game still isn't finished yet, but if you're interested in playing Cyberpunk 2077, set your expectations accordingly. This is not Deus Ex, and it is not a choose-your-own adventure game. It's a very linear, open-world shooter, much like Grand Theft Auto or anything by Ubisoft lately. If anything, it's more like first-person Watch Dogs, but not as good. And the Watch Dogs series has a lot of what I don't like about this game. Lots of talking about nothing, especially Watch Dogs 2. So the fun bits of Cyberpunk are really fun, but the boring bits can feel like a drag. But if you're able to deal with an average game set in a beautiful world and want to get lost in a dystopian cybernetic future for a while, I do recommend picking up Cyberpunk 2077, even with all of its flaws. But maybe wait for a sale.